Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. What a crazy week, and unfortunately, I've been sick and I was not able to cover all of the good news that were brought to you from the fronts of Ukraine. But I'm gonna do it right now, so this might be a longer video, but I'm gonna hope and try and do it as fast as I can. So we're gonna start right where there are significant troubles for Russians, which is Bakhmut front line. Around the south of Bakhmut, in just the recent couple of days, we had confirmations of full liberations of two what used to be settlements of Klishivka and Andriivka. Important here to understand is that it's not the settlements itself. The settlements don't exist. They're gone. It's just a name. The important part is the enemy fortification here. So the fortified positions of enemies in the area of these settlements that are still being used as kind of the central hubs, because settlements usually are built alongside the roads most of the times. So when Ukraine is able to capture some of these settlements, they're able to advance their logistics further, therefore developing the positions. And secondly, it's because, for example, Andriivka is located right at the local dominant height. So it's very important in that sense. And it's very important to underline as well the significance of Andriivka. Because here in Andriivka, the way that Ukrainians were able to take the settlement is the Russians' tactics backfiring at them. Because Russians were holding in Andriivka for as long as they could. They were dead centered at trying to stay inside the settlement, inside their fortified positions for as long as they could, even beyond the points of which there was already no point in holding it. And Ukraine did a pincer movement in which they cut off the entrance to Andriivka, and all of the Russian personnel that were still left inside of the city, including the commanders, including the troops there, they were either taken prisoner or destroyed. And that was a major blow, because overall in this fight for Andriivka, over the many months that it was happening, there was a whole 72 Brigade that was first introduced those couple of months ago as a reinforcing force to this direction, because as you can remember, maybe a couple of months is a little bit too long, but like at least over a month ago, when Ukrainians captured the positions north of Klishivka, they were advancing towards Andriivka, and they were like already pushing the Russians out. That's when the 72nd Brigade arrived, and the Russian brigade started reinforcing, trying to recapture Klishivka. That's when Ukrainians started experiencing that pushback, and now a lot of that brigade has been sent out already, either in body bags or in hospital beds. And secondly, a lot of their command now and whatever left of that brigade has been wiped out. That brigade exists mostly on paper now, and number of people that are still belonging to that brigade are either in hospital or they're running without their pants, so they're random refugees. That brigade is done. It can be obviously reconstituted. Russia will rebuild it and say, oh, look, it's here fresh and ready to fight, but it's not going to be the same. This creates problems for Russia, because right now the destruction of that brigade, losing of Klishivka position, losing of position of Andriivka, and wiping out of the commanding force, the whole backbone of the 72nd Brigade, means that right now there is a gaping hole inside of the Russian front line. And important here, where I'm saying gaping hole, it doesn't mean that no one is defending it. Obviously, it will be. But it's the position and part of the front line that was supposed to be held by this specific unit, like a brigade. It's now gone. It's not being held. So now everyone from other sides of the front line, the command needs to scramble to try to plug in this hole somehow. And resources are already stretched. Where we're going to translate next is towards the southern front line. But what I want you to understand is that Ukrainians are doing their plan, and their plan is bringing results. Ukrainians are applying, why is it suddenly green? Ukrainians are applying pressure on many points on the front line. Ukrainians are applying pressure everywhere. Obviously, the main direction, and I told you about in a couple of videos ago, that battle for Tokmak is going to be one of the most bloodiest battles that there ever been. Russians know just how crucial Tokmak is. And I explained that in a large sense, this settlement right here in the southern front by the name of Verbove, this one here that the Ukrainians are already poking, that settlement might as well be a gateway towards Tokmak. So if Ukrainians take Verbove, most probably they reach Tokmak, and if they reach Tokmak, they will literally start collapsing the southern front lines. And I told you that Russians understand that. And this is exactly what we're seeing. They are seeing the danger. And we've seen the reports that from Bakhmut direction, which was previously reinforced additionally with multiple different brigades, with multiple different units, these units were sent additionally to the south. Moreover, we're talking about what kind of reserves Russia is having. And I said that operative reserves for Russia some month ago were depleted. So operative reserves were reserves that were dedicated specifically for that direction. After that, they started picking reserves from other direction to continuously reinforce this. Then they also did reserves from the north part. Now, what Russia is also have been doing, they were trying to get units from the directions where they were defending and supposedly holding the line, such as for a long time around Bakhmut, where the 72nd Brigade held the line. Now, situation might be developing fast, but we will see what Russia will respond with around Bakhmut. I'm still a little bit skeptical about how much resources Ukraine has around Bakhmut, because I don't believe Ukraine has significant fresh resources in the area to execute any kind of significant push in direction of Bakhmut to get into that operational level in the operational area to go around and fast encircle Bakhmut. I don't believe Ukraine has the forces concentration needed to break through whatever defenses are left there. But what we are seeing is continuous stretching and degradation of Russian forces. Moreover, we know that Russia was preparing strategic reserves, because Russian doctrine talks about once the enemy has been stopped. Let's imagine a situation that Russia has stopped Ukrainian advances. Next step in defense is counterattack. So at that moment, you take your reserve fresh forces and you strike back at the enemy that is now exhausted, and you push it back without and try to regain the territory that was obviously taken maybe by the enemy. And more importantly, you strike the enemy in their weak positions to test if the enemy has enough forces to defend against your push. This was the Russian reserve that was prepared at the back. This reserve army that was supposed to be preparing, but it should have become operational by approximately the start of December, now has been, without fully completing their both training and complex, their training and equipment and preparation cycle, that whole army has been sent into Ukraine to again reinforce the southern direction. So we're seeing again Russia is violating their own strategy, their own by the book tactics, saying we will not go into counterattack because we will not have forces. They're sending the forces that they were preparing for counterattack to try to defend and prevent Ukraine from advancing any further. That is the situation what Russia is having. Importantly, because every time I say about this video, and people again misunderstand and think that what I'm saying is that the Russian front line is going to collapse, Ukraine is going to go into breakthrough, everything is going to be broken. No, what I'm saying is that Russia is putting itself in a lot of weak positions. Russia is executing many, many errors in their strategic approach to how to fight this fight. These errors might help them recoup in short term, but in medium to long term, this can cause, and the keyword here, can cause severe problems. The can cause means that it creates openings for the enemy to exploit. To exploit those openings, the enemy, in this case Ukrainian armed forces, need only one thing: resources. And this is where we're having a little bit of difficulties, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. So what we need to understand right now is that Ukrainian strategy, Ukrainian approach is working. Russians are really trying hard to keep the front line as static as possible. They're doing the best they can. Unfortunately, as we can see, it creates already tension. It's like a big stretched balloon. And at some point, there is a high possibility that it just might burst. We will see if that will happen, but right now, we already see that certain results is achieved, because taking out a whole brigade, destroying the command, taking many prisoners, that is nothing to go around with. That is really, really impressive, especially when we're going to be talking about resources dedicated. Southern front line. On the southern front line, Ukrainians have reached the enemy defense lines on the south. As the analysts that I'm listening to, they're saying that Ukraine is comfortably reached those frontline positions, the frontline trenches, the dragon teeth, and they are taking some of them over, and they're using the same trenches to defend themselves, to prepare themselves for further advances. So what the danger was, as I explained a couple of videos ago, is that Russian doctrine doesn't respond to the enemy breakthrough by hitting them where the enemy breaks through. What the Russian doctrine wants to do is create a cauldron or a pocket. So instead, what Russians are doing, they're attacking on the sides, both here from the north of Verbove, and they're trying to attack from the area of Robotina. It's more like from the area of Kopany, right over here. So Ukrainians, their plan that they were doing right now, because remember, as Ukraine liberated Robotina, there has been many, many reports where Russia has sent in a lot of their reinforcements, either from other directions or from that strategic reserves that they were preparing for the December maybe campaign. They have been reinforcing this area with a lot of fresh forces. And these fresh forces right now are trying to put pressure and close this pocket. They're trying to make sure that Ukrainians that reach this line are cut off. To counteract that, Ukraine has put themselves to use that front line, the trenches that Russians and trench positions that Russians built themselves, obviously trying to expand this area as much as possible. So that's why we're seeing some pressure north of Novoprokopivka, which is a village that is right here. It's a big against defensive position. And most importantly, they are trying to exhaust and break the ability of Russians to effectively apply force on the flanks. So that's why we're seeing mostly recently Ukrainians advancing towards the direction of Kopany, preventing Russians from attacking them from the flanks. They were also successful in many videos of stopping Russian advances from this area, and they're also, I hear, trying to apply pressure to try to push Russians away. What they're trying to do, to put it simply, they want to have this wedge as wide as possible on the flanks, so they are feeling comfortable pushing south. Will Ukraine have enough time? We don't know, because the timeline is about mid-October. That's everyone's estimates. We're going by the US estimates that General Milley was saying. Will it be enough? Will Ukraine succeed? We don't know. We will see. I still am optimistic about this. But interestingly, it might be possible that even if the mud season starts, the way that Ukraine operates, potentially they don't need to be as reliant on the weather as possible. So the question is more, does Ukraine have resources or not? I've explained a lot that Ukraine had a lot of resources. Ukraine had resources dedicated both to this offensive, both to attack on this. Now Ukraine for sure has used and engaged all of their spearhead brigades that were prepared. In my expectations, there were still brigades in reserves that could be sent to this front line. The problem is, and now we're transitioning to another front line, that there are a lot of Russian forces that are prepared in this area that are threatening Ukrainian forces with push towards Kupiansk, with push towards Liman. That is not a new development, is something new. And Ukraine has responded to that and sent in some of their reserves that were preparing for the push in the south to reinforce these positions in the north. And we don't know how much of that was sent. I have a feeling about what it is, but I don't have hard data to sustain it. So we don't know right now, and I don't have information to say how much reserves Ukraine still have. What I'm seeing right now is that Ukraine is still gaining ground in the south. Ukraine is still gaining ground in the east, but I'm not sure whether or not a big breakthrough is planned or it's going to be a continuous attrition warfare going forward. We will see. We will see. But here on the north, there has been many numbers stating that it was about 900 tanks in this area that is concentrated with over 100,000 troops. I was able to do a little bit of a follow-up and trying to understand where did these numbers come from? Like, how does Russia has so much forces concentrated in this area? And one might ask, well, why don't Russia just send these forces to defend to the south? Which is a good question, but different forces, different specialization, one thing. Second thing, a lot of defending forces might be already used to defend into their positions. And thirdly, that is not how Russian doctrine works. Their doctrine is always about you need to counterattack. So if you have forces that are specifically trained for attacking, potentially using them as an attacking force against enemy positions, forcing it to remove some of their reinforcements to defend this area, what exactly we're seeing here up the north, is more beneficial because the forces are still engaged, right? So whether they would be at the south or here at the north, it doesn't really matter. But here they're doing the job that they've been trained to. And the numbers here that people were referring to was reported by the Ukrainian armed forces. And these numbers relate to the on paper staff. So whenever Ukrainians are talking about how many men there are on direction, Russians, they're not assessing the state of that man, because a good military man always takes into account the worst possible scenario. You can hear this based on a lot of military analysts if you've been following this war. But militaries tend to talk about things in a negative scenario possibilities. So when Ukrainians are saying there's 100,000 troops in this area, what they're saying is there is this number of units of Russians in this area, and if we take fully formed units with full personnel in them, this is how much people there would be. And the same goes for tanks. So these numbers, like tanks or armored vehicles and so on, so these numbers that are given, it's not every unit being counted. It's more about general understanding in a worst case scenario, how much firepower are Ukrainians expecting to come to this area. And that is very important to understand because Russian forces are not in a fresh shape. Russian forces are not fully complected stuff. They are just not. And their tanks, we know that they have issues running with tanks. So all in all, into this northern direction, Russia has forces accumulated that they're drawing Ukrainian staff for, but Ukrainians have also sent reinforcements in the area. So right now we don't know that right now we should not expect that Russia will have any major gains, so you can sleep soundly at night. The question is more about whether or not 4 weeks is going to be enough for Ukrainians to break through the Russian positions, to make attrition work for Ukrainians, or whether or not this will transition into autumn and winter campaign. We will see. But Ukrainian staff already expressed their desires that they don't plan to stop. They want to continue their offensive going forward, which is potentially an option. And that's why I'm saying that maybe even the autumn weather will not be a stopping point. But we will see. We will discuss the state, the offensive, and we'll kind of discuss the results of it at the end of September, as I promised. And we're going to evaluate whether this was a failure or success, and what we can expect in the future. An important front line that we don't talk about very often is the sea. Because in the sea, for a very long time, it was, well, Russia has the navy, Ukraine doesn't, therefore Russia controls the sea. It changed significantly. Firstly, because Ukraine used the kamikaze boats, and remember, this is an excellent option for Ukrainians because there is no counterplay. Because Russia is using their ships, so Ukraine is using their drones to get those ships to either be damaged or force them to move out of the area of operations where they can influence trading, where they can influence Ukrainian naval or even air operations, such as planes flying over the sea. And Russia cannot respond by that. Like, this is not a strategy that Russia can copy. Because if Russia makes those kamikaze boats, what they will target? Civilian transport, they can do it anyway with their big boats. That's not the issue. If they wanted to destroy something, they would destroy it. The problem was that this is a tactic by Ukraine that cannot be copied, that cannot be replicated by Russia, because there are no targets for this tactic on Ukrainian side. And because of that, Ukraine has been applying a lot of pressure in the area, and now it's forcing a lot of Russian fleet to be extremely nervous. Second thing that happened was at the end of August, Ukrainians successfully captured the platforms that were used to extract gas and oil in the Black Sea, and Russia put a forward-facing radar installations on these platforms. So they were able to have eyes in this area of Black Sea. At the end of August, Ukrainian special forces were able to assault these platforms and take them out and take all of the equipment out, therefore making Russia completely blind in the area of around the sea. This is already paying its dividends, because now Russia needs to depend on the systems that are located on the west side of Crimea to make sure that they spot anything approaching. And Ukrainian special forces are already abusing this. We see this the most important with a strike in the Sevastopol harbor, where Russian warship and a submarine was hit in a dry dock. And potentially the biggest loss is actually not the loss of the ships themselves, because the biggest loss might be the inability to use dry dock going forward for months, because just getting those ships out of there will be problematic, and without even talking about what kind of damage was sustained by the dry dock. But more importantly is how did this strike came to be, because the strike on this dry dock came to, as with recent video were discovered, as Ukrainian forces infiltrated Crimea via the, as they stated, the submarine apparatus, so like proper special forces, and they were able to essentially highlight by the guidance to their missiles the targets to their command, and then confirm the destruction of those targets. So there were active Ukrainian special forces present on the peninsula in Crimea. And now we know that the same special forces helped targeted additional anti-air systems on the front line. We already know on Crimea. We already know that there has been 2 additional S-400 systems destroyed, including the radars, which just help make Russia even more blind in the area. This opens a whole Pandora's box problems for Russia, because right now that means that any further operations that Ukraine will conduct they will have even less capabilities to control what is happening with this western part. And if Russian eyes will continue to be taken out, then potentially, I'm not saying definitely, but there might be a very surprise operations and surprise front lines opening for Russians. That is a clear possibility. But it's a great job, and most important results of it right now is that Russia cannot repair their ships in Simferopol anymore, at least for a while, and a lot of their fleet is being pushed towards Novorossiysk, towards Russia, towards Kerch area. So now this area is almost non-operational for Russia because there are Ukrainian boats. And obviously this means that any kind of trading fleet vessels are now feeling a lot more confident in going into the sea area. So we can say that Ukraine, being a country almost completely without the navy, they are defeating strategically Russia on their naval warfare. This is extremely nice and important to know, and we're going to see how it will develop. There has been reports on the special operations activities also in the area of Kherson, which is south over here, but we'll leave it for now. Maybe I'll cover it in more details at some later point. After watching this recording, I realized that it was a little bit too long already, so I'm gonna make second part tomorrow, guys. Thank you so much for watching this. Thank you so much to moderators, everyone that is doing an amazing job. Please support Ukraine on the first comment under the video. Support this channel if you can. Slava Ukraine. I love you guys. See you next time.